Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the 2021 webinar series here at C2 Cyber. We're looking to discuss the supply chain vendor risk with upcoming episodes looking at the insurance market, luxury fashion. But today we're here to talk about the construction industry as a user and a generator of a lot of data, especially in the modern world. We've seen in recent incidents like the Colonial Pipeline and the water treatment plant in Florida, where relatively simple cyber issues can turn into big things that affect the critical national infrastructure of a nation. And they don't any longer need to be supported by nation-supported groups or even nation states. These things are quite easy to do, low barrier to entry. And so all of us involved in the industry, building things, facilities management, and running them in life, we're all responsible for the data that's produced and how we use it, how we keep it safe. So how big a challenge do we face? What can we do about it? Construction is often comprised also of temporary endeavors, so joint ventures put together, lots of individual companies coming together, pressure to hit deadlines, data security and how you manage that and all of the plans is not necessarily the forefront risk that people are facing. So how do we deal with those as well? I'm joined today by two great friends, Phil and Sarb. Phil is from Glimpse of the Future. Sarb is from the IoT Security Foundation. And so, Phil, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Hello, Jonathan. Well, my name is Phil Shatz, and I run online events highlighting success stories at the confluence of construction, technology, and project management. The event series is called Glimpse of the Future, and our mission is to build a community of change agents, people who are committed to exploring, developing, and trying new ways of working. So far, we've run 13 events with over 100 speakers over the past couple of years. And the majority of my time is spent talking to people about their projects and the technologies they are using or considering the use of. So,
Phil, if I could just interject before I come to Saab, how does the built environment come into being? The steps that are in that process. It's quite a complex thing, and it's getting ever more complex. Do you have a quick view?
It might not be quick, but yeah, I've got a view. The built environment has many phases: stakeholders, contributors, and ultimately beneficiaries. It's the greatest industry in the world as it shapes the world we live in, how we work, how we travel, how we spend our leisure time. But how does the built environment come into being? What are the steps in the process? It starts with a dream of what could be, as imagined by the instigator of the project. He or she is the genesis of the idea, and on the best executed projects, this person remains involved throughout. From there, the process goes through scenario analysis, feasibility modeling, environmental planning, design, in itself a huge area, value engineering, execution, closeout, handover, dispute resolution. Now, from mega projects, vast organizations come into being for these temporary endeavors, leading to ever larger numbers of people sharing more and more data. And here's the important bit. From a cyber perspective, the greater the number of individuals involved, the greater the attack surface. And then to get even more granular, if I may continue, an important facet of UK employment law favors contracting over employment. And this means that even individuals are treated as companies. And the effect of this is to exponentially increase the size of supply chains. You couple that with the drive to outsource anything not within our core competence areas, and huge webs of contractual relationships emerge, which will be completely opaque. For instance, go to any major construction site in this country, and only a small portion of the people on that site working there will actually be employees of the company that has the sign out front.
So they're all suppliers. They're all vendors.
They're all suppliers or suppliers of suppliers or suppliers of suppliers. Yeah. So why is this particularly pertinent now? I think it's because it's common for developed countries to try to build their way out of difficult situations. And with COVID, the UK and other countries around the world are pouring vast sums of money into the built environment and setting up a multitude of rich targets for nefarious actors. So what's the best way to protect yourself? Through third-party risk management, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, no, thank you, Phil. Sarb, may I hand over to you, sir?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here and joining the two of you. My name's Sarb Sembhi. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Virtually Informed, and one of my voluntary roles is as the co-chair of the IoT Security Foundation's Smart Built Environment Group. And my background and how I got into this was by chance, where about 15 years ago, I was interested in things that sit on the network that nobody's looking at and are interested in. And I looked at the vulnerabilities of network CCTV systems. And I was amazed at how vulnerable they actually were. And I complained to everyone, because those that I was looking at that time were commercial ones, but I complained to everyone, nobody's interested, and carry on looking. And this is in the days before we called them IoT things. There were cameras. But then I also looked at heating, lighting, air conditioning, burglar alarm, fire alarm, and they have the same problems. They're no different. And from those times to where we are today, I've got involved in more and more environments that are smart or supposedly smart built environments. And one of my sort of pains I had a couple of years ago when we were doing some building work at home, I said to the family that we would install every smart home technology if it met two conditions. One was if it didn't take data away from our home. Secondly, if it had built-in functionality to secure it. And after great research, we installed no smart home technology because everything wanted to take our data away, or it didn't have the controls to safeguard it. And in many respects, that's still the case today. And that's not just in sort of domestic or personal consumer devices. It's similar, although not exactly the same, in commercial products as well that go into buildings, either new builds or buildings that have been around for some time. And it's very pertinent right now. We're in a situation coming out of COVID. A lot of buildings are looking at installing more and more equipment that may be IoT run to safeguard the employees going back into the environment. And the idea is it's going to these things are going to reassure the workers going back in, but there's no guarantee that it will do if these devices are open to attack from outside.
So if you're a facilities manager and you're employing some sort of proximity thing to keep people 1 meter or 2 meters apart, or some other technology, somebody is wearing a device or they're using an app on their phone that knows where they are, that data, if it's not safe, also implies that the person's whereabouts is known to other people. And it's presumably fine if it's your family, or maybe not. But if it's a nefarious actor, then actually you've got a personal security issue with IoT in your office space. That's quite interesting. Okay, and where you're looking at large state-led deliveries, the National Audit Office is starting to look at how do you manage your data risk in your third parties? Are you looking at information security in your supply chain? And that's not just third parties, because people might stop at the prime. So they've got a prime contractor. My third party is secure, excellent. But the third party, to Phil's point earlier, has got fourth parties and fifth parties and subcontractor to subcontractors, which is not unique to construction, but it is very common. It's prevalent in construction. And therefore, you've got to start looking at them, because they all get sent the BIM data and the construction plans and everything else. So,
yeah, I just wanted to add to what you're saying. I totally agree. When we, in the IoT Security Foundation Smart Built Environment Group, our first white paper a couple of years back, we were looking at the different numbers and types of stakeholders that are involved with buildings and smart environments. And we came up with close to about 50 different key stakeholders from when the building is built and constructed. And all these key stakeholders, or majority of them, we're talking about 80, 90%, are third parties.
Yeah.
So there are so many key stakeholders, and they are absolutely key. You know, everyone from the telecoms provider through to the water supply, through to, you know, the concrete mixers, all of them, they are very, very important for the life and the development of the building through to it being occupied. And it's not like we're talking about one or two. All of them are key, and they're all third-party suppliers.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the in-life piece is the caterers and the security team and who's servicing the HVAC. I think what was a retailer in the US that, and it's a legacy example, it's not recent, but it was their HVAC supplier plugging a dirty laptop into their network that took down their EPOS system. And I think the challenge is that although that's a legacy example, we haven't moved on a great deal in terms of the security of the data. So we've got ever more volume of connected devices and thermostats and things. I still don't completely understand why you need to change the color of your light bulb every time you turn it on and off. But for some people, that's important. And all those things are run through an IP address. So how do you make sure that that's safe? It's a difficult one. So Phil, on the third party side, I've joined you before on your Glimpse of the Future webinars, and we've got lots of your other protagonists and presenters are delivering things like augmented reality and VR and so on. Or your friends, yeah, exactly. And so they're creating mountains of data, particularly when you start planning buildings for built up areas where urban environments where the VR and AR stuff's becoming ever more common. How do they deal with that? Do they secure that well? What's your experience of that happening on the ground?
I think the tension between the established players that have applications that have been around for a long time and are based upon code bases that are cold, software products that are no longer under active development, but that are in a maintenance mode, that these are the more vulnerable applications, really. Okay. Things that are based on applications and systems built on modern software engineering architectures are exponentially more hardened, right? Because there's so many more people using the code and looking for these problems. So legacy software is definitely an issue. But to answer your question more directly about how are these supply chains dealing with the transfer of data between applications, the sad fact of the matter is there's no established standard for secure data transmission, and I'm not sure there ever will be because the data structures are so completely different. So people rely upon password protected zip files or VPN technologies. And that's pretty much it. But the thing is that this problem is not going to go away. It's only going to get worse because what you have is innovation just flooding onto the market with the development of point solutions. So we've got this situation where people that have been building buildings, project managers and other skilled individuals, they have a lot of knowledge. And as they leave the workforce, they're trying to monetize that as a SaaS offering generally. Now you couple that with the number of people that are developing software nowadays, and you've got the perfect storm. You've got a tsunami of innovation just flooding over the market as the know-how meets the software engineering. Mm-hmm. So it's a very confused state, the construction and engineering and architecture software market as this tsunami of innovation just floods over it. And it's really genuinely quite challenging for companies to come up with practices whereby they can transfer data securely with so many vendors coming onto the market.
And so how do we, because another thing that we've noticed here in C2 Cyber is that the construction industry needs assistance in delivering secure ways of coordinating their information, managing their third parties and so on. Yes. But the principal piece there is people. So the people, the process, the technology is the piece that Sarb mentioned a minute ago, and I'll hand over again because on the technology side, that keeps changing ever more quickly. But in buildings, you're choosing things on day one that will go in for 25 years in some cases, or cannot be removed because it's too big. And so that's quite a big decision. Is it safe when you do it? But the two things that we can move the dial on are the people and the processes more easily. So in those temporary endeavors, in the joint ventures, how do you make sure everyone is delivering security or secure by design in the software, security by design in the physical environment, and making sure that is it safe is one of the questions that people ask, rather than is it merely quick to put up, is it efficient, is it well insulated, and so on. It's also got to be secure, because all of these things are getting smarter and smarter. So how do we do that when it's probably a Sarb question on the IoT side? You've got all these bits of data flooding in, and the people training, they're doing a different job. They're building the thing, not operating it, or vice versa. And the training needs need to be addressed. In the Smart Built Environment Group, we've got 2 guidance documents that are coming out in the next 2 months. Right now, just last Monday, we completed our internal review within the group. It's going to the whole of the IoT Security Foundation. And then once we've agreed it there, it will be available publicly in July. And the 2 documents, one is for property managers and owners of property, and the other one is for facilities. Later on this year, we have got a document for designers and one for manufacturers. So we are producing some guidance. One thing we haven't covered, because the idea is that we're beginning to start with the basics and build on all this, is the encryption and dealing with that side of things. And slowly we are beginning to sort of look at this and how we can progress and what we need to be working on and providing. But one of the key things we've got in the property managers document is that we should be starting within these organizations by looking at the governance side of things. How are we going to manage security within the property with the teams that we've got? What are the standards we're going to use? How are we going to make sure that with so much outsourcing going on of these things, who's going to be responsible for what and to what level, and the relationship and the interface with the cyber teams and how they're going to help? Because quite often, either in organizations, they find that they're not interested, or they're so interested they want to take things over to some extent, and not build the skills in-house. So there's all that going on, and we have been working on that. But one thing I wanted to mention that you covered just now when you talked about the idea of equipment going in for 25 years, you're absolutely right. Quite often we see the lifespan of devices, systems, that theoretically is supposed to be 10, 15 years. However, because there's nothing wrong with them, the real lifespan, a use of that technology is more like 25 years. And when you look at that, you've got 3 layers of life cycles of data. So you've got the life cycle of the data, which is the system data or the device data, which is, let's say, the operating system, the firmware, when the device came out, going on. And that's one life cycle. You've got life cycle of the settings of that firmware that was set in a particular way, and quite often that's not changed. Then you've got other data that might sit on that device on top of that, and each of these 3 levels are completely different in terms of the years and what sits on them and what's actually being protected. And that's
fascinating.
Ignored. I mean, that's ignored, And how do you
ask a question about that, Sarb? So at the lowest level, then the firmware level, it's how much risk exists there, and are there moves towards being able to flash updates at that layer?
It depends on how old the system is.
Well, yeah.
Some of them weren't made to be updated. I mean, when I was looking at this 15 years ago, I came across so many versions of Linux whereby the embedded Linux, that the system had been developed by a master student as a proof of concept, not ever imagining that vendors would take it and then put it into devices.
And one of the challenges with firmware updates, I don't know whether you see this go past on all your home devices, but mine all seem to be updating themselves all the time, is they've got to be connected to a server somewhere, generally via the internet, so that those firmware updates can even be delivered, which means they're in the building, you've suddenly got a load of hardware that never used to be connected to a sort of threat vector, as I would put it, so connected to the internet. And now you've got Ethernet cables running all over the place in equipment rooms, connecting all this stuff for precisely that, for monitoring and preventative maintenance and then firmware updates. So, so that's a real challenge. So that's a lot of data, and that's a lot of ways into a building that didn't used to exist.
One other thing about the life cycles or the lifespans, the end of life, quite often these products with these different data layers not being deleted, and the device is removed, but the data still sits on it, and anyone purchasing that device or finding it can get that data off there. And there's often quite a lot of telling things about where that device was on that device.
That plays back. That plays back to the temporary endeavour piece, which is that if you're standing an office up for that sort of thing and it's full of printers and scanners and all the rest of it, I think there's a police force in the US that changed all of its photocopiers and printers out and sent them all off to some recycling place and left the hard drives in. And on the hard drives were all of the informants' details and addresses and everything they'd ever scanned from an informant and all the other police business that goes through those printers and scanners. And it was just left, and they're not encrypted generally, and they're all sat in a warehouse because they've changed their printer estate. I wonder what happens to things that people don't even consider to be a cybersecurity challenge after they've finished the JV and shut the office down. I wonder where those printers go, because they've got plans and quotations and sources and means, I guess. That's quite an interesting question I hadn't thought of, because that's just recycled. Yeah,
Jonathan, you're such a great storyteller, and your story about the water treatment plant in Florida I find absolutely harrowing. Maybe that story leads into this one.
So the water treatment plant, people will have seen, that was in Florida in January this year, I think, and that was simply an insecure team viewer implementation, and anyone that's had to help a relative with their own computer, you might have used TeamViewer to take control of the one at the other end. Without putting a password on it, this seems to be how they were managing this water treatment plant from some central control center. It didn't have a password on it, and the levels of chemicals put into the water could be changed remotely, and were. It got caught by an on-site engineer who noticed the dials changing when they shouldn't have been, and he managed to contain this problem. The prevailing view is that the residents of the town were saved by this action. So this is no small thing. This is saving lives, right? Because you can dump more chlorine in the water or whatever it was that it was controlling. I've taken some soundings elsewhere in the industry around Europe, and that's not necessarily different here. So we're seeing lots of outstations, thousands of treatment plants all over the place, connected by remote access means. And it's a big machine. This is a volume game. So how do you secure that without having 5,000 different passwords in the central control place? This stuff, plus the water treatment plants, might be 50, 60 years old. You've got legacy systems in place, and you've got Band-Aids over the top and internet connections. How do they fix that? And so you've got third parties in there as well. You've got contractors, or you might use a specialist supplier for different bits and pieces. They've got your data as well. So this is quite difficult stuff. And the solution, therefore, is to get a view of your supply chain. So whether you need to do anything about it or not, we were recently visited today by a new customer, and we are going to be baselining all of their suppliers. They've got thousands of suppliers. So C2 will be going through all of those and triaging what is the inherent risk delivered by using this third party. So do they hold employee data? Do they hold customer data? Do they hold intellectual property or secret recipes? How do they protect it? Where do they keep it? Who has access to it? As triage questions. And then when we figure out which of those thousands of suppliers are the riskiest, we'll go off and have a look at how do you mitigate the risks, or transfer them, or otherwise manage them. And we'll do that to their highest 10%. And that's quite useful stuff. That's something that can be applied to a temporary endeavor like a JV, like a build project, just as easily as it is to something that is facilities management and is designed to be in place for 30 years. But you've got to make the decisions early on about how you track it and how you manage it. Much more efficient, much less costly to do it at the start than it is halfway through.
I'm curious how long it takes to profile, in this case, potentially thousands of vendors in the supply chain, and what the rollout looks like.
So the way that we do that, and other versions are available, obviously. The way that we do that is we take a cut of their supplier database, and we ask for specific types of information in there as well. So we can start looking at open source intelligence on their domains and their emails and everything else. And then we'll look at what we know they have access to in our customer. So do they have access to particular databases, employee data, tax data, financial or pension records? On the customer side, what did they buy? When did they buy it? Where were they when they bought it? If they bought it on a mobile phone, we might even know where they were standing, depending on what information is kept. And that plays partly into the whole Data Protection Act as well. So in construction, you're often building something for a client where they've got particular needs or particular wants, or they want their new house in the hills to have a nuclear bunker for some reason that's unique to them. And they don't want everyone to know that the thing marked storage room is actually a nuclear bunker. How do you get all of that system in place? How do you build the IoT in for the HVAC and everything else without that being out on the internet or leaked? So you've got to test the security of the supply chain when you're building it, and then when you're running it in life.
Jonathan, I think that's very important. One of the things that we try to look at in the IoT Security Foundation is if you're a building owner or whichever part you play in decision making and the third party suppliers, what you need to understand is what level of security you're actually looking for, so that you can actually ask for it from your suppliers. Yeah. And that's a key thing that I think many organizations miss out on. And there are various frameworks around that do enable people to do that. And the IoTSF have got one themselves, which is a compliance framework that they've got, which enables whatever user you are, whether you are the supplier or you're, whether you're on the demand side or the supply side, you can actually use it to determine how good your product is, or you can use it to determine what level of security you actually need. And I think that's a key thing in terms of looking at the governance and working with organizations like yourself that will go in, because it will equip you to know what it is you're looking for in those third parties as to what level they should be at in relation to what's being asked of the client.
And that, thank you, Sarb, but that also helps you match your effort to the risk. And so nobody can afford to test everything all the time. Absolutely. And so if you're able to triage and segment which pose the greatest risk, you can focus your resources on that. So I think we have a couple of question and answers, or questions certainly. The answers come from us. Okay, so the first question is, can we just insure against cyber risk in the supply chain? So I'll take that one if I may, because I've been prepping for our insurance webinar as well. So on insurance, there are cyber risk insurance policies available, and they do pay out. We've talked to several of the insurers, and they do pay out on the risks. They don't always pay out the whole cost. So there was an example in an energy generator where they only got 10% of their costs back from their insurer, because it was found that they hadn't done certain things in preparing themselves for an inevitable attack. There are some things, particularly when you're in the built environment, that you can't, you can insure against, but perhaps you shouldn't. So talking to one of our customers recently, and they're doing a big construction project inside the M25, and they've got a risk of unexploded ordnance. So they know they were on one of the routes for a World War II bombing campaign. There have been bombs on this route that they've discovered. And so you could just insure against it. But what if somebody is killed in the process of piling and digging the foundations and so on? And so they've elected to do more surveys, do more studies to make sure that where they are piling, they're not likely to encounter an unexploded munition. And that translates quite nicely into cyber. You could just insure against it, but rather than, and potentially there is a loss of life issue, but more likely is loss of customer, loss of reputation, and getting fined. Now, they're the negative sides. I try not to talk about them too much, but they are a fact of life. And you can't insure against losing all your customers. That's not something they'll pay out on. The second question comes from John Moore. At the end of life with transfer of ownership is another facet of cybersecurity that needs to be managed. So I think that question is, how do you manage cybersecurity after end of life, particularly when the asset or the building has been sold? Sarb, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, just a quick comment, if you don't mind, on the cyber insurance issue. I mean, one thing I think when it comes to cyber insurance, we mustn't forget is, whereas in life insurance, house insurance, shipping, whatever it is in life, most things we've got enough data and have had enough data for centuries. When it comes to cyber, I used to work in cyber just over 5 years ago, nearly 6 years ago. And the data that we've got for cyber, one, it's very limited. Two, the cyber field itself is changing so quickly that what data we've got is old data and it's not necessarily relevant now. So in terms of what you get and what you're not going to get, what you might be able to insure for, what you might not, is going to be changing over the next few years. So yes, at the moment, we've seen companies which have paid out, on claims on ransomware. So if you're building, or as the case was earlier, just the other week, you've got a pipeline, oil pipeline, and you get ransomware, you might be able to get payment out on it. But this will change, because just recently, after that happened last week, there was the AXA who used to pay out, then made a statement that they're not going to pay out on ransomware on new policies and certain conditions. A couple of days later, they themselves got attacked by ransomware.
Yeah.
So this was almost in reaction to that. So
I think that's a live incident. I'm not sure they've recovered that yet.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Oh, I missed this. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So the point being that when it comes to cyber insurance, there are things that are happening all the time that are really going to change the landscape. We're not sure necessarily where it's going to go, but we certainly don't have as much data as we have on other things. That was just a key point I wanted to make. And I know when I worked in it, it was very different in a 2-year space from what the insurers and the underwriters were saying at one point. They were changing things very, very quickly in many, many ways. So, sorry, just a couple of comments on that one. So coming back to the question you actually asked me, when it comes to decommissioning, you need to have right up front robust procedures for decommissioning any equipment, especially, and you can grade it in the same way you talked about managing risk in terms of your third-party suppliers, those that are highest, and you grade them. Effectively, you do the same thing with your equipment and your systems. You grade them in terms of the data that they have and what impact it's going to have, because you don't put them all through the same decommissioning.
Yeah, it's too expensive. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you, Sarb. So a question for you, Phil, that's just come in. So technology is transforming construction, and generally that's a great thing. But have you got any examples of innovations that show where particular risks can be avoided? And then if they have monumental quantities of data, are you creating another risk by attempting to solve the first one with an innovative solution?
What a great question. Love it. I think that the two most important areas of technology that are definitely transforming construction are, the first is what I call 4D modeling, where three-dimensional models to visualize what's going to be built across time are used to help to explain what the project's going to be. And this is particularly valuable in the early phase when the person who has the idea, the person who wants to sell this concept needs to get other people to buy it, whether it's for investment purposes or encouraging people to bid or to actually build it out. And then during execution, or to prepare for execution, the implications for improvements of efficiency and also safety are dramatic. To be able to sit with the team that's going to actually build something and walk through the evolution of the site in 3D over time as it changes wide, forward and backward. The stories I've heard about the increases of efficiencies are just dramatic.
So like a sort of modern time and motion study, you can do this live in AR, VR. Yeah.
Well, just on the screen or on your iPad, just wind forward and backward. You don't need any fancy goggles. I mean, yes, if you wear a headset and actually go to the site, you can see it being built, winding forward and backwards. But just sitting in a workshop with the people that are responsible for different areas of the construction of the project, and then working through that model together to change things and make it more efficient, is having a dramatic impact on execution efficiencies. And also, I would say earlier in getting the capital to fund these projects. Because let's face it, there's always going to be more projects that people want to execute than there will be capital available. So the best planned projects or the most thoroughly de-risked that can be visualized should win that race for capital. Anyway, that's point number one, 4D modeling. The second one, which is equally important, I would say, is around the areas of design for manufacturing and assembly, off-site construction, and then logistics. So there isn't really a term for the consolidation of all three of those, but in my head, I think of them as the same thing, right? When you design a building or some other structure and you design that for modular assembly, it's only the first stage before the off-site manufacturing of those modular components and then the just-in-time delivery using advanced logistics to get them to site. So, those are all done by different companies, and there's a lot of specifications that are involved. You're going to have personal information about those who are involved. You're going to have contractual details. There's all sorts of very sensitive information that's being passed down amongst parties. You
can't change it after it's been built, right? So you send the spec off, they make it off site, it gets delivered to the site. You can't then just change the build. It got built in a factory somewhere else. So the stakes are quite high on getting that right.
But again, the opportunities for efficiency and the cost reduction that it's driving are just phenomenal. Just absolutely phenomenal. People talk about how construction is behind the curve with technology compared to other sectors. I don't believe it. I don't believe it at all. And that's why I set up Glimpse of the Future, because I see such fantastic things happening.
Interesting.
I hope that was interesting.
And it sort of it leads into the final question before we'll do closing remarks. What impacts in construction would a data breach have? And so I think if we've got another one, which is, and it's a similar question actually. So how do construction companies balance the advantages of the technology versus increased requirements for security? And they're kind of linked together for me. But the impacts of a data breach in construction, it doesn't get built right. People can be nefarious. They can change pipe diameters. They can change cable runs. They can do all sorts of things which make the build something you've got to start again with. You've got the employee data. You've got the user data, the commissioning agent, or the client at the end. And so all of these data breaches might involve just embarrassment. But there can also be safety of life, because we're talking about the built environment. So this isn't gaming, and it's not a ethereal thing. It's a physical construct, and so health and safety rears its head, especially with coronavirus now. So people are designing new ways of mapping airflows and making sure that people stay segregated going in and coming out and all that sort of stuff. Quite interesting. Applying that retrospectively to existing buildings. So this final question is, how do construction companies balance the massive advantages of the technologies we've been discussing against the increased requirements of security. And that's probably one very quickly, please, Sarb, for Sarb, because you were talking about it a little while ago around what do you install and when do you install it, and so how much security does it actually need?
Yeah, I think like many things, this ties to maturity over a period of time. And we talked about the maturity of the data insurance companies have. A few years ago, we wrote a white paper, and it was comparing the maturity of the cybersecurity vendors compared to the physical security vendors. And the physical security vendors in construction, any part of the smart built environment, are way, way, way behind. They're not as behind as they were, but they certainly aren't that far forward either.
Right.
And there are many standards out there that vendors are beginning to get involved in, very, very large vendors. However, although they're getting involved in these standards to deal with this sort of thing, the challenge actually is they are participating in the standards, they're setting the standards, but they haven't actually started to implement the standards within their own product so far.
It's true.
Okay.
In many cases.
It's true. There's a lot of lip service for following these standards, but when it comes to spending the money on the dev resource that's precious, that actually understands that particular area and specialize in it, there's a lot of talk, but not enough walk in the walk.
And some of the standards that they're involved in, they've been involved in creating those standards to keep out the smaller vendors in some respects, to make sure that these standards are very complex. But coming back to that maturity question, I think we will get better, but it will take some time. It's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately.
So, what an excellent point.
A quick closing comment, please, Sarb.
It will get better, but it will take some time. And we will probably see some really, really bad examples. And some of the examples that our audience asked, we are going to see some responses, things go wrong. But unfortunately, we only see them when they become public, not before, and so on. So,
that is a challenge. See it in the news. Phil, from your good self.
We live in the best of times, and I'm an incurable optimist and believe that that great things lie ahead as technology contributes to improving our lives and taking us to places that we haven't been before, as individuals, societies, nations. And there will be risks around breaches of data and cyber, and it's important to be cognizant of those, but don't let the fear of these things hold you back from innovating. Be brave. Look at what's out there and embrace transformation, because the opportunities that come from taking a risk on doing things better will almost always outweigh the risks.
No, good point. Thank you.
And the IoT is producing guidance that will help with that. So we are doing lots there.
No, thank you, gents.
It's been a pleasure.
Just to wrap up from my side, Phil, I agree that great things lie ahead. The nearest great thing that lies ahead is our webinar on insurance on the 4th of June at the same time. So please don't be shy, join if that's of interest. We're going to be talking with some people from the insurance industry about cyber and third-party risk. And if anybody has any queries or wants to follow up with us on third-party risk management and how we propose to do that in C2, then please get in touch. But thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.